The cruelest thing said to Miss Honora Selwyn that morning was said with a giggle, in a warm, bright room full of wedding flowers, by a woman in a great deal of lace who had everything Honora did not and was still not satisfied. And Honora bore it as she had borne 10 years of such things, with a straight back and a steady eye, and a dignity that the woman who wounded her could not have purchased with her whole barony. It was her sister's wedding breakfast. Lydia, little Lydia, whom Honora had raised from a child of 10, had fed and taught and sat up with through fevers, had clothed out of her own going without, had been married that morning beautifully and respectably to a good young clergyman with a comfortable living and a kind face, and the small house was full of flowers and sunlight and the particular happiness of a thing long worked for at last come right. It was Honora's triumph, though no one in the room but Lydia knew it. The fruit of 10 years of sacrifice, the youngest of the 3 orphaned Selwyn children safely and lovingly settled, the last great duty of Honora's long, unmarried youth discharged at last. She had stood at the back of the church that morning and watched her sister wed, and had felt a happiness so deep and so complete that it had no room in it for any sorrow on her own account. She had done the thing she set out to do all those years ago when she was 20 and the world fell in. She had kept them together and raised them and seen them safe, and if the cost had been her own youth, her own marriage, her own place in the world, then it was a cost she had paid gladly and would pay again, and she stood at 30 with empty hands and a full heart, and asked nothing more of life than to have been allowed to do it. And then, the Baroness Mowbray, resplendent in lace, surrounded by the little court of fashionable people she had brought with her from town, caught sight of Honora across the room, and smiled, and said in a voice pitched to Carrie, with a little silvery giggle that turned heads, "Why, can it be Honora Selwyn? My dear, how good of you to come to your sister's wedding, though I confess I scarcely knew you. You have grown so settled, looking. And still unclaimed at 30? Still quite on the shelf? How very brave you are to show your face among all the bridal happiness, with no prospect of any of your own. I do call it brave. Most women in your situation would hide, but then you always were a singular creature, dear Honora, always so content, weren't you, to be passed over. Still unclaimed at 30. Well, someone must be, I suppose, or the rest of us should have nothing to measure our good fortune against." The little court tittered. The word hung in the warm, bright room like a stain. Unclaimed. As though a woman were a parcel left too long at the coaching inn, a thing no one had troubled to come and collect. Unclaimed at 30. As though Honora's whole life of love and labor and sacrifice were merely the long record of her failure to be chosen by a man. And Honora Selwyn felt the old familiar cruelty land where it always landed, in the one tender place that 10 years of dignity had never quite armored over, and she lifted her chin and met the Baroness's bright, cruel eyes, and prepared to answer with the quiet composure that was the only weapon she had ever allowed herself. She never made the answer, for at that exact moment, at the very instant the giggle died and the room waited to see whether the poor unclaimed spinster would weep or wilt, there came the sound of wheels on the gravel outside, the sound of a great carriage drawing up at the gate, and a footman, hurrying in with his eyes wide and his voice unsteady with the importance of it, announced into the suddenly silent room a name that none of them had ever expected to hear spoken in that modest house, a name that turned every powdered head and stopped the Baroness Mowbray's giggle in her throat. His Grace the Duke of Ellesmere, His Grace's carriage is at the gate, and His Grace begs leave to wait upon Miss Selwyn. Miss Selwyn. Not the bride, not the family. Miss Honora Selwyn, the unclaimed spinster, the woman on the shelf, the creature the Baroness had been pitying not 10 seconds before, was being waited upon at her own gate, in his own carriage, by a duke. And Honora stood very still in the ringing silence, the color gone from her face, while the room turned slowly from the Baroness to her and back again, for she alone in that company knew whose name that was, and what it had once meant to her, and why a duke's carriage at her gate, 10 years too late, was not a triumph at all, but the reopening of the oldest and deepest wound of her life. To understand why the Duke of Ellesmere's carriage at her gate struck Honora Selwyn not as a rescue, but as a wound, you must understand first who she was and what she had given, and why a woman of 30 came to be standing at her sister's wedding with empty hands and a full heart and a name that society spoke with pity. She had not always been poor, nor always alone. She had been born the eldest child of a learned, gentle, improvident gentleman, a scholar more than a manager, a man who loved his books and his children and had no head at all for money, and of a mother quick and warm and clever, from whom Honora had her dignity and her wit, and the first 20 years of her life had been happy, in a modest, comfortable way, in a pleasant house full of books and music, and the easy affection of a family that loved one another. There had been every expectation that Honora, who was handsome then, in her clear-eyed way, and accomplished and well-liked, would marry well and happily in her turn. And then, in the space of 2 terrible years, the world fell in. Her mother died first, of a fever, swiftly and cruelly, leaving 3 children, Honora at 18, Thomas at 10, little Lydia at 8, and her father, who had never been strong without his wife, declined from that day. And worse, it emerged, as a dying man's affairs are gone into, that his improvidence had been deeper than anyone knew, that he had stood security for a faithless friend and been ruined by it, that the pleasant, comfortable life had been built on sand, and the sand was washing out from under them even as he lay dying. He died when Honora was 20, and he died ruined, leaving his 3 children almost nothing but debts, a little furniture, the lease of a small house, and each other. And Honora Selwyn, at 20, at the very age when other girls were dancing and being courted and laying out their bright futures, stood at her father's grave with a brother of 12 and a sister of 10 clinging to her hands, and understood, with a clarity that never afterward left her, that there was no one in the world to save them but herself, that if she did not hold them together they would be scattered, Thomas to some grudging distant cousin, Lydia to another, herself to a third, the family broken apart and parceled out as orphaned poor relations always are, and that she would not, while she had breath and strength, allow it. She was 20 years old, with no money, no protector, and no power in the world, but the power of her own 2 hands and her own unbreakable will, and she set herself that day to the task that would consume the whole of her youth, to keep her brother and sister together, to raise them, to see them safe and settled, whatever it cost her, and it cost her in the end everything a woman of her time was supposed to want. But she did not know that yet, standing at the grave. She knew only that they were hers to save, and that she would save them, and that nothing else in the world signified beside it. But there had been, before the world fell in, a young man, and there had been, between that young man and Honora Selwyn, something that might have become the whole happiness of both their lives, had the timing of it been kinder. His name was Lawrence, and he was then the heir to the dukedom of Ellesmere. Lord Lawrence, a young man of 27, grave and clever, and a little shy beneath the burden of his rank, who had come into the neighborhood that last bright summer before her father's death to stay with a relation, and had met, at a country assembly, the eldest Selwyn girl, and had been, quietly and completely, undone by her. For Honora, at 19, had been everything the fashionable beauties of his own circle were not. She was clever, really clever, well-read and original, able to talk to him about the things he cared for, and had no one to share with, the books and the ideas and the questions that the brilliant, empty young women of the ton found tiresome. She was kind, without calculation, in a world where every kindness shown to a duke's heir was a move in a game. She had a dry, warm humor that made him laugh as he had not laughed in years, and a dignity that owed nothing to fortune or fashion, and a way of looking at him, Lawrence, the man, and not at the coronet behind him, that no woman of his acquaintance had ever managed. He had fallen in love with her over the course of one country summer, slowly and then all at once, in libraries and gardens and the long talks that two people fall into when they have found, against all expectation, their own kind. And she had fallen in love with him, with the whole undefended completeness of a clever girl's first and only love, believing, for he gave her every reason to believe, that he felt as she did, that the difference in their stations was a thing his evident devotion would somehow overleap, that the autumn would bring a declaration and the happiness she had not even known to hope for. The autumn brought her mother's death instead, and then the long decline of her father, and then his ruin, and then his death. And in the space of those 2 terrible years, the bright girl who had been courted by a duke's heir vanished, and in her place stood a woman of 20 with 2 orphaned children to raise and not a penny in the world, withdrawn from the assemblies and the society where Lawrence might have found her, buried in grief and debt and the ferocious labor of survival. They did not meet in those 2 years. She had no thought to spare for him. She had a family to save. And he was away, called by his own father's failing health to the family seat in the north, kept there by duties of his own. And when at last he was free to come south again and seek her out, the bright girl he remembered had become a ruined orphan in a small rented house, the object of the whole neighborhood's pity, encumbered with 2 children and a mountain of her father's debts, the least eligible woman in England for a man who would one day be a duke. And here is where the timing turned cruel. Here is where a love that might have been the happiness of both their lives was lost. And here is where, you will not be surprised to learn, a giggling young woman with a great deal of ambition and very little heart first did the Selwyns a wrong that it would take 10 years, and a duke's carriage at a gate to begin to set right. The summer of the young attachment deserves a fuller telling, for it was the one wholly happy season of Honora's youth, and the thing the lie destroyed, and she carried the memory of it, folded away with the hope, for 10 long years. They had met at a country assembly where Lord Lawrence, dragged there reluctantly by his hostess, had been standing apart in the particular misery of a shy, clever man at a loud, frivolous party when he overheard a girl in a plain gown say something, to a friend, not meaning to be heard, so dry and so exactly true about the absurdity of the whole occasion that he laughed out loud for the first time in months. And he had sought an introduction and found that the girl with the dry tongue was Miss Selwyn, the scholar's daughter, and that she could talk, really talk, about books and ideas and the great questions with a quickness and a depth and an originality that left him, a duke's heir educated by the finest tutors in England, scrambling to keep pace. And he had gone home that night turning over their conversation in his mind, and had contrived to meet her again and again all through that bright summer. They met in the lending library, where they argued cheerfully over the merits of the poets, his classical severity against her romantic warmth, neither ever quite winning, both delighting in the contest. They met in the lanes and the gardens, walking and talking, while their respective chaperones dozed and gossiped at a discreet distance. They fell, without quite noticing the moment of it, into the particular intimacy of 2 people who have found, against all the odds of birth and circumstance, the one other person who sees the world as they do, who can finish each other's thoughts and laugh at the same absurdities and fall into easy silences and emerge from them having each been thinking, it turns out, the same thing. He had never in his life been able to be simply himself with anyone, the man and not the rank. With Honora he forgot the rank entirely and was only Lawrence, happier than he had ever been. And she fell in love with him as a clever girl falls in love, but once, wholly and without reserve, believing, because he gave her every reason to believe, that the difference in their stations was a mere accident his evident devotion would overcome, that the summer was the beginning of her whole life's happiness. He never declared himself in words, that summer. He was waiting, he told himself, until he could do it properly, until he had prepared his family, until he was sure of his own worth to offer. He was young, and the great leap frightened him even then in the small ways that should have warned them both. But he said it in 100 other ways, in the books he brought her, marked at the passages he wanted her to see, in the way he sought her out at every gathering and could not keep his eyes from her. In a certain evening in a garden, when the talk had fallen into one of their easy silences, and he had taken her hand and held it, just held it, and looked at her, and neither of them had needed any words at all to know what was understood between them. She had gone home that night the happiest she had ever been, certain as a girl is of the sunrise, that he loved her, and that all the rest was only a matter of time. And then her mother fell ill, and the time that was only a matter of time ran out, and the garden, and the held hand, and the marked books, and the bright certain summer became the thing she had lost, the thing she grieved once and folded away, the proof she carried in secret for 10 years that she had, whatever the world said of her, been truly loved once, by a man who then proved too small to be brave for the loving, which was a grief, but also, in the darkest years, a strange cold comfort, that the failure had been his and not hers, that she had been worthy of the love even if he had not been worthy of the leap. If you're listening by your own fire tonight, the lamp low, the dark drawn close, the day's labor set down at last, then settle in, and let me tell you how a love was lost to cowardice and a lie, and what it cost to come back for a thing you were not brave enough to claim the first time. For this is a story about being claimed, and about the cruelty of that word, and about a woman who was told all her life that she had failed to be chosen, and who knew in her own steady heart that she had never been any man's to claim at all, that she belonged to herself, and had spent herself where she chose, on love and duty, and would not be pitied for it by anyone. I shall tell you before the end where in the world I picture you sitting, but first you must learn how the wound was made. The young woman with the ambition and the little heart was then Miss Selina Vane, and she is now the Baroness Mowbray, and she was, that last bright summer, a guest in the same neighborhood, and had marked Lord Lawrence's growing attachment to Honora Selwyn with the cold attention of a woman who wanted the heir to Ellesmere for herself and could not bear to see a penniless clergyman's daughter take him. She had not the cleverness to win him honestly. Lawrence found her tiresome, as clever men find women whose only subject is themselves. And so she did what such women do, and won by spoiling rather than by deserving. And her chance came 2 years later, when Lawrence at last returned to the South, freed by his own father's lingering recovery, meaning to seek out the Selwyn girl he had never been able to forget, and learn whether there was any hope for him. He came back uncertain. That was the weakness Selina worked on. He had been 2 years away. He did not know how Honora had received his long silence. He had heard vaguely of the family's ruin, and was troubled by it not because he cared a straw for her poverty, but because he feared, being young and proud, and unsure of his own worth beneath the rank, that she might think he came to take advantage of her fallen state, or might have hardened against him in his absence, or might refuse him out of a fierce ruined pride. He was full of doubt, and doubt is the soil in which a clever liar plants. And Selina Vane, encountering him before he could reach Honora, and reading his hesitation with her quick cold eye, planted her lie in it with exquisite care. "You have heard about poor Miss Selwyn, I suppose," she said, all false sympathy. "Such a tragedy, but she bears it nobly, they say, quite nobly. Indeed, I had it from her own lips when I called. She says she has done with all thought of marriage forever, that her family is her whole life now, the children and her duty, and that she would refuse any man who offered, however grand, for she will not be parted from her brother and sister and will not burden any husband with them. She was most decided, quite fierce about it, in fact. She said, I remember it particularly, that she had put away all such girlish notions, that the Honora who danced and dreamed was buried with her father, and that she wished only to be left alone with her duty and pitied by no one. So you see, my lord, there is nothing to be done for her, however one's heart aches. She has chosen her path, and will not be moved from it, and would only be wounded by an offer she is resolved to refuse. Best leave the poor creature her dignity, do not you think? Best not trouble her with a suit she has sworn to reject. It was very nearly true, which is what made it deadly, for Honora had resolved to keep her family together at any cost, had refused other offers on those grounds, did speak of her duty with a fierce decision. Selina had merely taken the truth and turned it by 1 degree into a lie, had made a woman's sacrifice sound like a rejection, her duty like a closed door, her dignity like a wall against the very man who would have leapt it gladly. And Lord Lawrence, young and proud and full of doubt and longing for a reason not to risk the great frightening leap of defying his family for a ruined woman, believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative, and that, as he would understand only 10 years later to his lasting shame, was the true sin. Not that he was lied to, for any man may be lied to, but that he wanted to believe the lie, that he seized on it with relief, that he let a giggling schemer's word excuse him from the one brave thing love required, which was to go to Honora himself and ask her himself, and hear the answer from her own mouth. He did not go. He believed the lie because it freed him from the leap, and he turned and went back north and left her. There is a question that may trouble you, as it troubled Honora when at last she understood the whole of it, how a man who loved as Lawrence claimed to love could be turned aside by a single conversation with a woman he did not even like. And the answer, which the Duke himself came to understand only in his 10 years of solitude, is that the lie did not turn him aside at all. The lie merely gave him permission to do the thing he was already, in his fear, longing to be permitted to do. For he had come south that autumn, genuinely meaning to seek Honora out. But he had come, too, in a state of mounting dread, the dread of a young man on the brink of the largest and most frightening decision of his life. To offer for Honora Selwyn now, in her ruin, meant war with his mother, who had made her ambitions for his marriage perfectly plain. It meant the open scorn of his whole world, which would see a duke's heir throwing himself away on a penniless clergyman's orphan with 2 beggar children to keep. It meant taking on, with her, a mountain of her father's debts and the lifelong charge of raising another man's children. It meant, in short, choosing love over every other thing his birth and breeding had taught him to value, and weathering, alone, the disapproval of everyone whose good opinion he had been raised to court, and it required, for all these reasons, a courage that the shy, proud, untested young man of 27 simply did not yet possess. He wanted Honora, but he wanted, too, the easy approval of his world, and the favor of his mother, and the comfortable, unexamined life that lay before him, if he did the expected thing, and he was torn between the 2 wants, in an agony of indecision, when Selina Vane found him. And so when she told him her lie, that Honora had sworn off marriage, would refuse him, wished only to be left to her duty, she was not, in truth, deceiving a man determined to do right. She was rescuing a man desperate for an excuse to do wrong. The lie did not break his resolve. It relieved him of the burden of resolve altogether. It let him tell himself a story in which there was no choice to make, no courage required, no failure on his part. She did not want him. The matter was decided. There was nothing to be done. He might withdraw with a clear conscience and a heavy heart, the noble victim of circumstance rather than the coward who would not leap. He seized that story with both hands. He did not examine it. He did not test it. He did not do the one obvious thing that a man truly determined to have her would have done in an instant, which was to go to Honora and ask her himself. For to go and ask would have risked discovering that the story was false, and that the choice was still his to make, and that the courage was still required of him. And he did not want in his deepest heart to discover that. He wanted to be excused. Selina excused him. And he went north, telling himself it was grief, when it was in truth relief wearing grief's clothing. And only years later, alone, did he come to see that the lie had been merely the instrument, and that the hand that threw away his happiness had been his own, and that he could not even have the cold comfort of blaming the liar, for a braver man would have seen through the lie in an afternoon, and he had not wanted to see through it at all. Honora never knew of the lie. That was the bitterest part in the years that came after, though she did not know there was a lie to be bitter about. She knew only that the young man she had loved with her whole undefended heart, the man who had given her every reason to believe he loved her too, had, when the world fell in and she needed him most, simply not come. He had been away when her father died. She had understood that, had not blamed him for it. But the months passed, and then the years, and he did not write, did not call, did not seek her out. She heard distantly that he had returned to the south and gone north again without once coming near her, and she drew at last the only conclusion the silence allowed, that his love had not been what hers was, that it had been the pleasant summer fancy of a great man for a clever girl, easily set aside when her circumstances made her an inconvenient choice, that when it came to the point, to the leap, to the cost, he had weighed her against his rank and his family's expectations and found her wanting, that she had been all along a thing he might have claimed when it was easy and pleasant and prudently declined when it was hard. The slow death of Honora's hope in the 2 years after her father died was a quieter grief than her father's death, and in some ways a harder one, for a death may be mourned and done with, but a hope dies by inches and will not lie down, and must be killed over and over before it consents at last to stay dead. At first she had been too consumed by survival to grieve the silence at all. There had been the debts to face, the creditors to placate, the little house to secure, the children to feed and clothe and comfort in their bewildered loss. There had been no hour in any day for thinking of Lord Lawrence, and she had told herself, in the rare moments she thought of him, that he was away, that he could not know, that when he learned of her troubles, he would come. And for a while she half believed it. She would hear a carriage in the lane, and her foolish heart would leap. She would see the post arrive and look, despite herself, for a hand she knew. She would catch herself in the middle of the hardest labor, imagining the moment of his coming, the door opening, the grave, kind face, the words that would make everything bearable. She did not let herself dwell on it. But the hope was there, banked low, refusing to go out. It died slowly over those 2 years starved of any fuel. She heard, eventually, that he had been south again, and had not come. She heard that he had gone north without a word. She heard at last that the old Duke was dead, and Lawrence was Duke of Ellesmere now, a great man fully launched upon his great life, and that there was talk of this grand match for him, and through it all, not a line, not a word, not the smallest sign that he remembered there had ever been a clever girl in a country lending library who had thought herself loved. And the hope, starved long enough, died. But it died hard, and it died in stages, each stage a fresh small grief, the stage of making excuses for him, and the stage of ceasing to make them, and the stage of anger, and the stage of telling herself she had imagined the whole thing, that the summer had meant nothing, that she had been a foolish girl who mistook a great man's idle kindness for love. And at last, the final stage, the cold acceptance, when she stopped looking up at carriages in the lane. There was one night, she remembered it always, when she let herself grieve the whole of it, once and thoroughly, and had done. The children were asleep. The house was quiet. Some small thing had brought the summer back to her, a book perhaps, or a turn of the light. And instead of pushing it away as she usually did, she let it come, all of it, the library and the garden and the held hand and the bright certainty and the long silence and the death of the hope. And she sat by the dying fire and grieved, deliberately and completely, for the marriage she would not have and the love that had not been brave enough and the whole different happy life that had been within her reach and had slipped away. And she wept that one night as she had not let herself weep even at her father's grave, for she had had to be strong there, and here, alone in the dark, she could at last be weak. And then toward dawn she dried her eyes and banked the fire and made herself a vow that this was the last night she would spend on Lord Lawrence, that she would fold the whole of it away and never take it out again, that she would not let a man who had not been brave enough to want her cost her one more hour of the life she still had to live and the children she still had to raise. And she kept the vow, kept it for 10 years, with only the faintest secret exception, the one folded-away certainty she allowed herself in the worst hours, that she had been truly loved once, and that the failure had been his. It was not much to keep, but in 10 years of being called unclaimed it was, sometimes, just enough. She did not let it break her. She had not the leisure to be broken. She had 2 children to raise, but she folded the hope away, quietly, completely, with a kind of grim ceremony, one bad night when the little ones were asleep and the house was quiet, and she let herself grieve, once and thoroughly, for the marriage and the love and the bright future she had lost. And then she rose in the morning and put it from her, and never spoke of him again, and set herself to her life as it was, and not as it might have been. And she taught herself, over the long years that followed, a lesson she came genuinely to believe, that she had not been jilted but liberated, that a man who would not leap was not a man worth grieving, that the love she had felt had been real on her side, and that was enough, that she need not be ashamed of having loved truly merely because she had loved someone who proved unworthy of it, and that her worth did not depend, had never depended, on whether Lord Lawrence or any other man chose to claim her, that she was Honora Selwyn, who kept her family together when the world fell in, and that this was a thing of more worth than any coronet, and that she would not, ever, let the world or the Baroness Mowbray or her own treacherous, lonely heart persuade her otherwise. And so the years passed, and Honora raised her brother and sister on almost nothing, with infinite labor and infinite love. She took in fine needlework and copied manuscripts in her good clear hand, and taught the pianoforte to the children of neighbors, and turned and returned the same 3 gowns for a decade, and went without comforts, without society, without the smallest indulgence, that Thomas might have his schooling, and Lydia her few advantages, and she did it all with a straight back and a cheerful face, asking no pity, so that the neighborhood, which began by pitying the poor ruined Selwyn girl, ended by half-revering her, in the grudging way of the world, as a woman of remarkable character, all but those, like the Baroness Mowbray, who needed her failure to validate their own choices, and who could not forgive her the dignity that her poverty had not been able to touch. And Thomas grew up clever and good, and went, on a scholarship Honora's labor had helped to win him, to take orders in a curacy of his own, and Lydia grew up sweet and pretty, and this very morning had married her kind young clergyman, and Honora, at 30, stood at the wedding breakfast with her great task complete, every penny of her sacrifice repaid in the safe-settled happiness of the 2 children she had saved, and was told by a giggling baroness that she was still unclaimed, still on the shelf, still a failure, and bore it because she knew better, and would not give the cruelty the satisfaction of seeing it land. And then the carriage came to the gate. The 10 years of Honora's labor were made of 10,000 small, hard, ordinary things, and it is only in their sum that the magnitude of what she did becomes clear, and the magnitude of the insult in the word unclaimed. She rose before light every morning to lay the fires and start the bread, for they kept only one maid of all work, and could not always keep even her. She did the fine needlework that brought in a little money, ruining her eyes by candlelight, over other women's wedding clothes and christening gowns, stitching for the happiness of strangers the celebrations she would never have herself. She copied manuscripts and legal papers in her beautiful clear hand, hour upon hour, for the attorneys and scholars of the town, until her fingers cramped and her shoulders ached. She taught the pianoforte to the unwilling children of farmers and tradesmen, walking miles in all weathers to their houses for the few shillings each lesson brought. And out of these scraped and stitched and copied pennies she fed and clothed and schooled 2 growing children and kept a roof over them, and a fire in the grate, and a table that was never lavish but was never quite bare. And she did it for 10 years, without rest, without complaint, without a single one of the comforts or pleasures or small indulgences that other women her age took for granted. And she gave them, Thomas and Lydia, more than food and shelter. She gave them a childhood against every odds, gave them love and laughter and learning and the sense, which children of disaster so rarely have, that they were safe, that someone strong stood between them and the cold world, that they were treasured and not merely endured. She taught Thomas his Latin herself, from her father's old books, until he was ready for the school the local clergyman, recognizing the boy's gifts and the sister's heroism, helped to find a place for. She sat up with Lydia over her lessons and her little troubles, and in time, her first heartaches. She made their small, poor home a place of such warmth that neither child ever, in after years, remembered those days as years of poverty at all, but as the happiest of their lives, ruled by a sister who was mother and father and teacher and friend all at once, and who never let them see how tired she was, or how frightened, or how much she had given up. That was perhaps the greatest gift of all, that she carried the whole weight herself and let them carry none of it, so that they grew up not as anxious children of disaster, but as confident, well-loved young people, fit to take their places in the world. And they did take them, Thomas in his curacy and Lydia in her good marriage, and the taking was Honora's true monument, more lasting than any built of stone. There was one who saw it all, and valued it rightly, through all those years, the Dowager Countess of Stanmore, Honora's late mother's dearest friend, a fierce, ancient great lady who had known Honora from a child, and who alone of all the county's great people never for one moment pitied or patronized her, but watched her long sacrifice with a fierce partisan admiration that grew, year by year, into a love as fierce as any mother's. The Dowager Countess could not give Honora money. Honora would not have taken it, and the old lady knew better than to offer. But she gave her what she could, her open friendship, her public championship, her formidable presence at Honora's side whenever the world's cruelty grew too pointed, her standing testimony before a county that would have liked to forget the ruined Selwyns that Miss Honora Selwyn was a woman of more worth than the whole of the fashionable world put together. "That girl," she would say, fixing her black eyes on whatever fashionable fool had presumed to pity Honora, "has more character in her worn-out glove than you have in your whole overdressed body, and you will speak of her to me with respect, or you will not speak to me at all." And the world, which feared the Dowager Countess, learned to be careful, and Honora, who had so few champions, had at least that one, fierce and unwavering, and was more grateful for it than she ever quite found words to say. It is worth telling before we go on of the offer Honora refused when she was 22, for it shows the exact shape of what she chose and what she gave up, and why the word unclaimed was so monstrous a lie when the Baroness flung it at her, for she had not lacked for offers, not at first. A young woman of 22, even ruined, even encumbered, may still be wanted by a certain kind of man if she is handsome and capable and dignified, as Honora was, and within 2 years of her father's death there came an offer that would have solved, at a single stroke, every material difficulty of her life. It came from a Mr. Pemberton, a prosperous widower of middle years, a sensible, respectable man with a good house and a thriving business and no children, who had observed Honora's character through her trials and concluded soberly that such a woman would make him an excellent wife and a capable mistress of his household, and who offered her marriage and comfort and security and an end to the grinding poverty and ceaseless labor of her days, on one condition: the children must go. He would marry Honora, but he would not take on another man's half-grown son and young daughter. Thomas and Lydia must be placed elsewhere, with relations, at school, wherever orphaned poor children are placed. He wanted a wife, not a ready-made family of beggars. It was not cruelly meant. It was merely the sensible stipulation of a sensible man who saw no reason to burden himself with children not his own, and it would have saved Honora's life, would have lifted her at 22 out of the poverty that was even then crushing her, into ease and security and respectability, and all it asked was that she give up the 2 children she had sworn at her father's grave to keep. She refused it without an hour's hesitation. She thanked Mr. Pemberton for the honor, and told him plainly that she could not marry any man on any terms that required her to abandon her brother and sister, that they were the whole purpose and meaning of her life, and she would sooner labor in poverty till she died than buy her own ease at the price of their security. And Mr. Pemberton, who was not a bad man, only a limited one, shook his head at her folly and went away and married a more sensible woman within the year. And Honora went back to her needlework and her copying and her teaching and her going without, having chosen, with open eyes and at 22, a decade of poverty over a comfortable marriage, because the marriage would have cost her the children, and she never once, in all the hard years that followed, regretted the choice, for she understood that she had been offered a bargain and had declined it, and that the declining was the proudest thing she ever did. This was the woman the Baroness Mowbray called Unclaimed, as though no one had ever wanted her, when the truth was that she had been wanted and had refused at terrible cost, because the wanting came with a condition she would not meet. She was not a parcel no one collected. She was a woman who had been offered collection and had said no, because she would not be collected without the 2 small souls she had made her own. And there is all the difference in the world between the woman no one wants and the woman who will not be had on any terms but her own. And the Baroness, who had taken the first comfortable offer that came her way and called it good fortune, could not have begun to understand the difference, which is precisely why she needed so badly to believe that Honora was merely a failure, and could not bear the suspicion which gnawed at her, despite everything, that the unclaimed spinster she mocked had simply valued herself and the souls in her keeping at a higher price than the Baroness had ever dared to ask for her own. The Duke of Ellesmere had learned the truth 6 months before, at his mother's deathbed, and it had changed the whole course of his life and brought him at last, 10 years too late, to Honora Selwyn's gate. The Duke's 10 years were emptier than Honora's, and in their way unhappier, for hers were at least full of purpose and love, and his were full only of duty and regret. And it is worth seeing them briefly, for they were the slow working out of the punishment a coward earns. Outwardly he prospered. He succeeded to the dukedom. He managed his vast estates conscientiously and well. He took his seat in the Lords and spoke, when he spoke, with sense and weight. He became, by every public measure, a successful and respected man, the very pattern of what a duke should be. But the man inside the duke had stopped somehow. That autumn he turned away from the south. Something had closed in him and would not reopen, and he moved through his prosperous life like a man going through the motions of a part he no longer believed in, grave and competent and entirely without joy. He did not know at first what was wrong with him. He told himself he was merely of a serious temperament, that the cares of his position weighed on him, that the melancholy that settled deeper on him with each passing year was the natural condition of a great man burdened with great responsibilities. He did not let himself name the truth, which was that he had cut the living heart out of his own life with his own hand, and that no amount of duty or success could grow it back. His mother pressed him to marry. It was her dearest project in those years, to see her son make the great match his rank deserved, to see the dukedom secured with an heir. And she brought before him, season after season, the most eligible young women in England, beautiful, accomplished, well-born, well-dowered, everything the world could ask. And he refused them all. He could not have said why at first. He would meet some flawless young beauty, and his mother would watch hopefully, and he would feel nothing, less than nothing, a kind of gray distaste at the very idea, and he would make his excuses and withdraw, and his mother would despair, and another season would pass. It was only slowly, over years, that he came to understand the nothing, that every woman he met he measured, without meaning to, against a clever girl in a country lending library, and found wanting, that the part of him that might have loved another had been given, entire, to Honora Selwyn one bright summer, and had never been returned, and was not his to give again, that he was, though he had abandoned her, more faithful to her in his ruined, solitary way than many a husband is to a living wife, faithful with the terrible fidelity of a man who has thrown away the one thing he wanted and cannot, will not, make do with any substitute. And so he did not marry, and grew older, and grew lonelier, and grew sadder, and watched his mother's hopes for him die one by one, and could not explain to her or to anyone the simple devastating reason that he had loved once and failed the love, and that a man who has done that has spent something that does not come again. He thought of Honora often in those years, wondered where she was, how she did, whether she had married, whether she was happy, and he never once in 10 years found the courage to inquire, still less to go and see, for he had built his whole survivable version of the story on the belief that she had refused him, had chosen her duty, was better off without him. And he could not bear to disturb that belief with any fact that might contradict it, could not bear to learn, for instance, that she had suffered, that his abandonment had cost her, that the comfortable story of her noble, self-sufficient choice was itself a kind of lie he had told himself to sleep at night. So he did not inquire. He let her be a closed chapter, a grief he had made his peace with, a door he never opened, and he might have gone to his own grave that way. The faithful coward, the great empty duke, had his mother not, dying, opened the door for him with her last breath, and shown him the room he had refused for 10 years to look into, and the wreckage of 2 lives lying in it, and the truth that it was not too late, quite, if he had at last the courage to do what he should have done at the start. He had never married. That was the shape his cowardice had taken, for a coward's punishment is so often to be left alone with what he ran from. He had gone back north that long-ago autumn and buried the loss, and told himself the lie that Selina had told him, that Honora had chosen her duty and would have refused him, and he had thrown himself into the business of his rank, and succeeded to the dukedom on his father's death, and become by every outward measure a great man, a conscientious landlord, a respected voice in the lords, a duke of substance and weight. But he had never married. His mother, the old duchess, a hard, ambitious woman who had been only too glad, 10 years before, to see her son's unsuitable attachment to a ruined nobody quietly die, had pressed him for years toward this great match or that, and he had refused them all, one after another, unable to say why, knowing only that something in him had closed when he turned away from the south that autumn and had never opened again, and he had grown into a grave, solitary, faintly melancholy man, rich in everything but the one thing, who had loved exactly once in his life and let it go, and could not, for all his power, forgive himself for it. And then his mother lay dying, and at the last, with the strange compulsion to truth that sometimes comes to the dying, she had told him what she had never meant to tell him, that the attachment he had grieved for 10 years had not died as he believed, that she had known at the time of Selina Vane's interference and had been glad of it and had let the lie stand, that she had indeed in her own correspondence quietly encouraged the breach, had made sure Lawrence heard nothing to contradict Selina's account, had wanted the ruined girl gone and had got her wish at the cost, she saw it now, dying, of her own son's whole happiness. "I thought I was saving you," the old woman had whispered. "I thought a duke could not marry a ruined clergyman's daughter with 2 beggar children to keep. I thought you would thank me, but you never married Lawrence, and you were never happy, and I have watched you be alone for 10 years, and I am dying, and I find I cannot take it with me. She did not refuse you. She never refused you. The girl loved you, and I helped to drive her off, and you let yourself be driven because it was easier than the fight. And between us we threw away your life. I am sorry. It is too late, but I am sorry. There, now you know. Do with it what you can." And the Duke of Ellesmere, 37 years old, had sat by his mother's body in the gray dawn, and understood that the central tragedy of his life had been a thing engineered by a liar and permitted by a coward, and that the coward was himself, far more than his mother or Selina Vane, for they had only offered him the lie, and he had taken it gladly because it spared him the leap. And the bitter truth he had to live with now was not that he had been deceived, but that he had wanted to be, that a braver man, a man who loved as he had claimed to love, would have gone to Honora herself and asked her and heard the truth from her own lips, and that he had not gone because he had been afraid of his mother, afraid of the world, afraid of the great frightening cost of choosing a ruined woman over his rank and his comfort and his family's approval. He had not paid the cost. He had let her pay it instead alone for 10 years. And now, undeceived and unforgiven and free at last, he found he had only one thing left that he could do, which was to go to her, not to claim her, for he had forfeited any right to claim her, but to confess and to ask and to do, 10 years too late, the brave thing he had failed to do the first time. And so he ordered his carriage and went south and came on the morning of all mornings to find her at her sister's wedding and drew up at her gate while a baroness was giggling that she was still unclaimed at 30. So now you know what the room did not when the footman announced him. And you will understand why Honora Selwyn, standing white and still among the wedding flowers, felt not triumph, but a kind of dread, and why the Baroness Mowbray's giggle died in her throat, and why the whole brilliant, cruel little company turned from the spinster they had been pitying to the gate where a duke's carriage stood, and did not know what they were looking at. He was shown in. And the years had changed him. Honora saw it in the first glance, had taken the shy, proud, uncertain young man she had loved, and made him grave and weathered and sad, a great man with a great man's bearing and a deep-settled melancholy in his eyes that had not been there at 27. But it was Lawrence, unmistakably Lawrence, and the sight of him, after 10 years, went through Honora like a blade, reopening in an instant the wound she had so carefully healed over, so that she had to call on every reserve of the dignity she had spent a decade building, merely to stand still and meet his eyes and not betray, before all these watching strangers, that this grave great stranger had once been the whole hope of her heart. He crossed the room to her, through the parting, staring company, and he did not bow with the cool politeness of a duke greeting an acquaintance. He bowed low, very low, with a grave, deliberate humility that made the watchers murmur, the bow of a man to someone he honors above himself. And he said, in a voice pitched low but steady, for her and not for the room, "Miss Selwyn, forgive me for coming upon you so and on such a day. I would not have intruded on your sister's happiness for the world had I known, and I will go at once if you bid me. But I have come a long way, and I have something to say to you that I should have said 10 years ago, and I find I cannot wait another hour to begin to say it, lest my courage fail me again as it failed me then. I do not ask you to receive me here before all these people. I ask only for the favor of a private word, at whatever hour you will grant it, today, tomorrow, whenever you can bear the sight of me, for there is a wrong I did you, long ago, that you do not even know was done, and a truth you have never been told, and I cannot rest. I have not rested in 6 months until you have heard it from my own mouth. Will you see me? That is all I ask today. Will you let me tell you the thing I should have told you 10 years ago?" And Honora Selwyn looked at him, at the grave, sad, humbled face of the man who had not come when she needed him, and had come now when she did not, who had let her believe for 10 years that she was not worth the leap, and stood here now bowing as though she were a queen, and felt a great many things at once, none of which she allowed to show. The old love, not dead after all, but only sleeping, stirring traitorously at the sight of him. The old wound, throbbing, a cold, clear anger she had never known she carried. And over all, the hard-won dignity that was the truest thing she owned, which told her steadily that whatever this was, she would meet it on her own feet and her own terms, and would not be swept off them by a duke's sudden penitence any more than she had been broken by his long-ago neglect. She was not a girl of 19 now, to be undone by a great man's attention. She was Honora Selwyn, who had kept her family together when the world fell in, and she answered him with a composure that cost her everything and showed nothing. "You may call tomorrow, Your Grace," she said evenly, "at 11, when my sister and her husband have gone, and this house is quiet, and I am at leisure to hear whatever you have come so far to say. I confess myself at a loss to imagine what it can be after 10 years' silence, but you have asked for a hearing, and I was never one to refuse a hearing to anyone, however little I expect of it. Tomorrow, then, at 11. And now, Your Grace, you will forgive me, but it is my sister's wedding day, and she is leaving within the hour, and I will not have it overshadowed by you or by anyone. Good day, until tomorrow." And she turned from a duke, with perfect courtesy, to go and embrace her departing sister, leaving the Duke of Ellesmere and the silenced Baroness and the whole staring company to understand that whatever power had just walked into that room, it had not for one instant displaced the quiet sovereign dignity of the unclaimed spinster they had all 10 minutes before presumed to pity. She did not sleep the night between the wedding day and the morning he was to call, and the not sleeping told her things about herself she would have preferred not to know. She had thought herself so thoroughly healed. 10 years she had spent building over the old wound, layer on patient layer, until she could have sworn the ground was solid. She had folded the hope away so completely that she had half come to believe she had imagined the whole summer that the girl who loved Lord Lawrence had been someone else entirely, a stranger she remembered with distant pity. And then his carriage had come to the gate, and one glance at his grave, changed face had shown her how thin the healing really was, how near the surface the old self still lay. For her heart, the traitor, had leapt at the sight of him exactly as it had leapt at Carriage's in the lane 10 years before she taught it not to, leapt with the same undefended gladness, as though no time had passed, as though the wound had never been made. And lying awake that night, she was furious with it, and frightened of it, and grieved by it all at once. Furious that 10 years of discipline could be undone in a heartbeat by a man who had not earned the right. Frightened that she might, after all, be weaker than she had believed, might be swept off the hard-won ground of her dignity by the sheer force of a love she had never quite killed. And grieved, most of all, by the discovery that she had never quite killed it, that under all the healing the love was still there, stubborn and alive and absurd, waiting all these years for a man who had not deserved the waiting. She lay in the dark and argued with herself, the two Honoras at war, the girl who wanted, against all sense, to run to him and forgive everything and have at last the happiness she had been cheated of, and the woman who knew her own worth and would not be swept anywhere, who had survived his abandonment once and would not lay herself open to it again, who insisted that whatever he had come to say, she would hear it on her feet, with her guard up, and grant nothing her judgment did not sanction. And toward morning the woman won, as the woman had always won in Honora for 10 years, but it had been a closer fight than she liked, and she rose pale and resolved and a little shaken, having learned the uncomfortable truth that her peace was not, after all, the settled, invulnerable thing she had believed, but a peace held by daily effort over a love that had never died, and that she would need all her strength when he came at 11, not to let the traitor in her heart give away what her judgment had not yet decided to grant. He came at 11 the next day into the quiet, emptied house, and he told her the truth, and it was the hardest hour of both their lives. He told her all of it, plainly, sparing himself nothing. He told her of the lie, of Selina Vane, now the Baroness Mowbray, and the words she had carried to him that long ago autumn, the half-truth turned by one cruel degree into a wall between them. He told her of his mother's part, and of the deathbed confession that had undeceived him 6 months before. And then, because he was determined to do this thing honestly or not at all, he told her the part that shamed him most, that the lie, though real, had not been the true cause of his failure, that the true cause had been his own cowardice, that a man who had loved her, as he claimed to love her, would not have taken a schemer's word for so great a matter, would have come to her himself and asked her himself and heard the answer from her own lips, that he had not come because he had been afraid of his mother, afraid of the world's opinion, afraid of the enormous cost of choosing a ruined, penniless woman over his rank and his comfort and his family's approval, that he had let himself believe the lie because the lie released him from the leap, and had chosen, in the end, the easy path and the comfortable life and the approval of a world he did not even respect over her, and that he had been punished for it justly with 10 years of solitude and regret, and would carry the shame of it to his grave. "I am not here to excuse myself," he said, standing in her small, quiet parlor with his hat in his hands like a supplicant, all his ducal grandeur laid aside. "I have no excuse. I was lied to, but I wanted to be lied to, and that is the whole of my guilt, and I do not flinch from it. You loved me, your mother. My mother said you loved me and I let a coward's fear and a liar's word persuade me to abandon you, alone, ruined, with 2 children to raise, because the truth, that you might have had me and I might have had you, would have required a courage I did not then possess. You paid for my cowardice for 10 years, Honora. You paid in poverty and labor and loneliness and the world's pity and that giggling woman's cruelty, while I sat safe and rich and miserable in the north, telling myself a lie I half knew was a lie. I have come to confess it and to beg your pardon, which I have no right to expect, and to tell you, though I have forfeited any right to say it, that I loved you then, truly, with everything in me, and that I have loved you every day of the 10 years since, and that I have never married because I could not, because there was no one else and never could be, because you were the once and only love of my life, and I threw you away out of fear and have mourned you ever since. That is the truth, all of it. I am not the man who should be saying it. I am only the man who is. Do with it what you will." And Honora Selwyn listened to the whole of it in silence, very pale, very still, her hands folded in her lap, and when he had finished she did not weep, and she did not soften, and she did not, though every traitorous fiber of her long, faithful heart was straining toward him, fall into the arms of the man she had loved and lost and never stopped loving. She sat quiet a long moment, ordering her thoughts, mastering the storm of 10 years' grief and anger and reawakened love. And then she lifted her clear, steady eyes to his, and she said the thing that would decide everything, the thing that a lesser woman, a more grateful or more frightened or more desperate woman, would never have had the dignity to say, "Thank you, Your Grace, for the truth. It cost me a great deal to hear it, and it cost you, I think, a great deal to say it, and I honor the saying. I am glad to know I was not, after all, simply found wanting and set aside, that there was a lie and a fear, and not merely your cool judgment that I was not worth the having. That is something. That is, in fact, a great deal, and I will not pretend it is nothing. But you must hear what I have to say in turn, and you must hear it to the end." She drew a breath. "You loved me, you say, and could not be brave for me. Well, you have been brave today. I grant you that. This confession was bravely done, and late as it is real. But you will forgive me if I am not, at 30, the girl of 19 who would have wept for joy and asked no more. I have lived a whole life since you left me to it, a hard life, and a worthy one, that I built alone, without you, out of the wreckage you helped to leave me in. And I will not now simply set it down and pick up the happiness you offer 10 years late, as though the 10 years had not happened. They happened. I lived them. And I find I have a question for you, Your Grace, before I can say anything else at all, and the whole of my answer hangs upon yours." "My question is this," said Honora. "You loved me, and could not be brave for me 10 years ago when it would have cost you everything, your mother's favor, the world's good opinion, the easy grand life that lay before you, when choosing me meant choosing a ruined woman with 2 children and a mountain of debt, and defying your family, and weathering the scorn of every Baroness Mowbray in England. That was the test, Your Grace, and you failed it. You took the easy road, And now you come to me when it is easy, when my brother and sister are raised and settled and gone, when my debts are long paid, when there is no cost to you at all in choosing me, save the mild surprise of the world that a duke should marry a poor spinster, which a duke may weather with a shrug. You offer me your hand now that it is safe to offer it. And I must know before I can feel anything at all, whether you have actually changed, whether the coward who could not leap for me when it was hard has become a man who would, or whether you have merely waited all these years until the leap got small enough to manage. For I will not, your grace, hear me. I will not be the safe choice you finally felt able to afford. I was worth the hard leap 10 years ago, and I am worth it now, and I will give myself to no man who wants me only because wanting me has at last become convenient. So that is my question. Have you changed? And how am I to know it? Words will not serve. You were always good with words. It was deeds you failed at. Show me the man, your grace. I am done being told. And the Duke of Ellesmere looked at her, at this magnificent, formidable, dignified woman who had every right to refuse him and was refusing so far to make it easy, and felt, beneath the sting of her justice, a kind of soaring relief, for he saw that she was right, entirely right, that the test was a real one and a fair one, and that here at last was a thing he could do, a cost he could pay, a leap he could make, to prove with deeds what his words had forfeited the right to claim. He did not protest or plead or offer her more words. He bowed his head and accepted her question as just and said only, "You are right. You are entirely right, and I honor you for the asking of it, and I will not insult you with words where I owe you deeds. You shall have your proof. Give me only the chance to make it, and you shall see before the world whether the coward has become a man. I do not know yet exactly what shape the proof will take, but I will know it when the moment comes, and so will you. And it will cost me publicly and dearly, for that is the only proof worth anything. A thing that costs nothing proves nothing. Will you grant me that? Not your hand. I have not earned it, only the chance to earn it. Will you let me try?" It was the Dowager Countess of Stanmore who helped Honora see her own way clear in the days that followed, for the Dowager Countess, a fierce, ancient, plain-spoken old woman who had been Honora's late mother's dearest friend and had watched over Honora's long sacrifice with a fierce partisan love, descended upon the small house the moment she heard the news, and sat Honora down and told her some truths. "You did right to question him," the old woman said, "and you would do wrong to refuse him out of hand, and you are in danger, my dear, of doing the second while telling yourself it is the first. I have watched you 10 years, Honora Selwyn, and I love you better than my own children, and I will tell you the flaw in you that no one else dares. You have made your dignity into a fortress, and you have lived behind it so long, so safe, so untouchable, that you are half afraid to come out of it even for a thing worth coming out for. You will dress up your fear as principle. You will tell yourself you are refusing him to protect your worth, when the truth may be that you are refusing him to protect yourself from the terror of wanting something again and perhaps losing it again. Now hear me. Your worth is not in question. It never was. You are the worthiest woman I know, and a duke is lucky to sue for you. But a worth, child, is meant to be spent, wisely, on the right thing by your own free choice, but spent, not hoarded behind a wall till you die safe and alone with all your dignity intact and unspent and useless. So test him. You are right to test him. Make him prove the man with deeds. Make it cost him. Make him do publicly the brave thing he failed at. But if he passes, if he truly proves himself changed, then do not, out of the long habit of self-protection, refuse the happiness you have more than earned. That would not be dignity, Honora. That would be fear wearing dignity's coat. And I did not watch you be brave for 10 years to see you turn coward at the last, for a different reason than his, but a coward all the same. Test him. And then, if he passes, be as brave in the taking as you were in the giving. Promise me you will at least be honest with yourself about which it is, the principle or the fear. That is all I ask." The 3 weeks between the wedding day visit and the great assembly at Lady Carberry's were, for the Baroness Mowbray, the most agreeable she had spent in years, for she gave them over entirely to the work she loved best, which was the management of other people's reputations to her own advantage, and she had, she believed, a delicious situation to manage. She had been badly startled at first by the Duke's appearance at the Selwyn wedding, startled and, for one cold moment, afraid, for she alone of all the company that day understood that the Duke and the spinster had a history, and she alone knew her own part in ending it, and the sight of Ellesmere's carriage at Honora Selwyn's gate had sent a chill through her that the warm, bright room could not dispel. But the Baroness was nothing if not resourceful, and she had recovered quickly and reasoned herself back into confidence. The thing could not be serious. A duke did not marry a penniless spinster of 30. It was unthinkable. The world did not work so. The visit had been some whim, some belated gesture of charity or guilt. Whatever lay behind it, it could come to nothing, for nothing was what such things always came to, and her task was simply to make sure that the world understood it so, before any absurd rumor could take root and embarrass them all. And before, she did not quite let herself think, any inquiry into the matter could turn up the old story and her own part in it. So she set to work. She put it about in every drawing-room in the county, with her silvery giggle and her air of amused good sense, that the Duke of Ellesmere's call upon Miss Selwyn had been the merest condescension, a great man's kindness to a fallen family he had known slightly in his youth, no more, that any other construction was too ridiculous to entertain, that poor Honora, she feared, might even have her foolish hopes raised by it, which would be a pity, for of course nothing could come of it, and the poor creature would only be made more absurd than ever when the Duke's polite distance made the truth plain. She was masterly at it. She did not attack Honora directly, and that would have been crude, but wrapped every cruelty in a sugar of false concern, so that to repeat her poison was to seem merely kind and sensible. And she had the great advantage that what she said was exactly what the world expected to be true, for the world, too, found it unthinkable that a duke should marry such a woman, and was glad to be told it could not be so. Within a fortnight she had the whole county comfortably agreed that the Selwyn business was nothing, that the spinster's hopes, if she had any, were laughable, and that the only question remaining was how cruelly amusing it would be to watch the truth dawn on her. And then the masterstroke. She arranged through Lady Carberry that Miss Selwyn should be invited to the great assembly, the largest gathering of the season, so that the whole county might witness together the Duke's polite indifference and the spinster's deflation, and the absurd little rumor be laid publicly and finally to rest. The Baroness was particularly pleased with this stroke. She imagined the scene with relish, the poor spinster in her made-over gown, hoping, the Duke bowing coolly and passing on, the whispers, the pity, the giggling, Honora Selwyn put back before all the world in the place where the Baroness needed her to stay. She had, in short, built with loving care a stage for Honora's final humiliation, and had not the smallest suspicion, as she sent out her invitation and anticipated her triumph, that she was building instead the stage for her own, that the Duke had asked the Dowager Countess precisely which gathering would assemble the most of the world and the most of the Baroness's malice in one room, and that the assembly she designed as the scene of the spinster's deflation would prove instead the scene of the spinster's vindication, the coward's redemption, and the public unmasking of the giggling liar who had set the whole tragedy in motion 10 years before. The cruel so often build their own scaffolds and invite the county to watch. The proof came 3 weeks later at the great assembly at Lady Carberry's, which was the largest gathering of the county's fashionable society that season, and to which the Baroness Mowbray had made very sure that everyone of consequence was invited, including, to her spiteful satisfaction, Miss Honora Selwyn. For the Baroness had heard, of course, of the Duke's astonishing call at the wedding, and had spent 3 weeks putting it about, with her silvery giggle, that it had been a mere act of distant charity, a great man's condescension to a fallen acquaintance, that there could be no question of anything more, that the very idea of the Duke of Ellesmere and the unclaimed Selwyn spinster was too absurd to entertain, and she had engineered Honora's invitation precisely so that she might enjoy, before the whole county, the spectacle of the poor spinster put back in her place, the Duke politely distant, the absurd little hope publicly extinguished. She had arranged, in short, a stage for Honora's final humiliation. And the Duke of Ellesmere, who had asked the Dowager Countess quietly what gathering would draw the most of the world and the most of the Baroness's malice, walked on to that stage at the height of the evening, when the great rooms were full, and the music playing, and the whole county assembled, and did the thing he had failed to do 10 years before. He crossed the crowded ballroom, and the crowd, sensing something, began to still and turn and watch, and he went not to the great people, the earls, and the dowagers, and the baroness holding court in her lace, but straight to where Honora Selwyn stood, in her plain dark gown at the edge of the room, and before he reached her he was already speaking, clearly, his voice carrying into the spreading hush, so that there should be no mistaking it, no possibility of its being later denied or diminished. Miss Selwyn, I have come to say to you, here, before the whole of this company, and as publicly as I know how, the thing I was too great a coward to say 10 years ago, when it would have cost me everything and I had not the courage to pay it. I loved you then. I have loved you every day since. And 10 years ago, when your family fell and you were left ruined and alone with 2 children to raise, I let a liar's word and my own cowardice and my mother's ambition persuade me to abandon you, to choose my rank and my comfort and the good opinion of rooms exactly like this one over the only woman I have ever loved. I took the easy road. I let you pay alone for 10 years, a price that should have been mine to share. It was the great wrong and the great shame of my life, and I name it here before all of you, because the wrong was done where the world could see it, and the righting of it must be done the same way. The room was utterly silent now. The Baroness Mowbray had gone the color of her own lace. The Duke turned deliberately and let his eyes rest on her for one cold moment before he went on. And I will name, too, since we are naming things, the author of the lie that gave my cowardice its excuse, for she is in this room, and has spent 10 years mocking the woman she wronged, and 10 weeks giggling that this could never be, and I find I have no patience left for it. The Baroness Mowbray, when she was Miss Selina Vane, came to me that long ago autumn and told me that Miss Selwyn had sworn off all marriage, would refuse any man, wished only to be left to her duty and pitied, a lie, built cleverly on the bones of a truth, designed to drive me off so that she might pursue me herself, and I, to my shame, believed it because it freed me from the leap. She has been laughing at Miss Selwyn ever since, for being unclaimed, and I think it only just that the whole company should know that Miss Selwyn was unclaimed not because no man wanted her, but because the man who wanted her most was a coward, and because the woman now giggling at her lied to make it so. There, it is said. Let her giggle at that. And then he turned back to Honora, and before the whole stunned assembly he went down, a duke, on one knee on Lady Carberry's ballroom floor, in front of the entire county, and looked up at her and said, I cannot undo the 10 years. I cannot give you back your youth, or spare you what you suffered, or be the brave man you deserved when you needed him. I can only be brave now publicly, at whatever cost, and lay it all before you and the world and ask you not to be claimed, for you were never any man's to claim, and I know it now, but to choose freely, if you can find it in your heart, a reformed coward who loves you, and who will spend the rest of his life paying the debt of the 10 years he failed you. Will you have me, Honora? Here before them all, where I should have stood 10 years ago? I am not too late this time. Tell me I am not too late. The whole assembly held its breath. Every eye in Lady Carberry's great rooms was on the plain-dressed spinster at the edge of the floor with a duke kneeling before her, and Honora Selwyn, who had been mocked in those very circles for 10 years as a failure and a creature to be pitied, found the entire fashionable world that had scorned her now hanging silent on her word, and discovered that the dignity she had built through a decade of poverty and labor and quiet endurance was more than equal to this moment and to these people, and that she was not afraid of any of them. She did not look at the kneeling Duke first. She looked at the room, swept it slowly with her clear, steady eyes, the assembled county who had pitied and mocked and giggled, the powdered fashionable people who had measured their good fortune against her supposed failure for 10 years. And when she spoke, her voice was perfectly composed, and it carried to every corner, and it owned that room as no duchess or baroness in it had ever owned a room, because it spoke from a worth that none of their fortunes or titles could buy or touch. "You have all, I think, had a great deal of entertainment from me these 10 years, she said, from the spectacle of the poor Selwyn girl, ruined and unclaimed, raising her brother and sister on nothing and failing year after year to be chosen by any man. Unclaimed at 30, the Baroness was good enough to call me, not 3 weeks ago, at my own sister's wedding, unclaimed, as though I were a parcel at a coaching inn, left because no one thought me worth the collecting. Well, let me tell you, all of you, what I have learned in 10 years of being unclaimed, for I find I should like you to hear it, once, plainly, from me." She lifted her chin. "I was never unclaimed, because I was never any man's to claim. I belonged to myself every hour of those 10 years. In all my poverty, I belonged wholly and only to myself, and I spent myself freely, by my own choice, where I judged I was most needed, on a brother and a sister who had no one else in the world, whom I raised and kept and saw safe, and who are worth more to me than every coronet in this room. That was not failure. That was the freest and the worthiest use a woman ever made of her own life, and I would not trade 1 hour of it for the whole of the comfortable marriages you have all been pitying me for the want of. I was not on the shelf. I was not passed over. I was about the most important work of my life, and I did it, and it is done, and it was magnificent, and I will be pitied for it by no one, not by a baroness who lied to make me suffer, and not your grace." And now at last she looked down at the kneeling Duke. "By a Duke who comes to claim me 10 years too late." A sound went through the room. The Duke did not move, his eyes fixed on her face, and Honora's voice, when she went on, had changed, had lost none of its dignity, but gained something warmer underneath, something that had been buried 10 years and was struggling now toward the light. "And yet," she said, more quietly, "you did not come to claim me, did you? I heard you. You came to ask me to choose. You went down on your knee before all the people whose good opinion you once valued more than me, and you named your own cowardice, and named the Baroness's lie, and threw away your dignity and your standing and your comfort on a poor spinster the whole county has been laughing at, publicly, at ruinous cost, with nothing to gain by it but me. And that, Your Grace, is the very thing you failed to do 10 years ago. That is the leap you could not make. You have made it now, in front of everyone, when it costs you everything. And a man does not do that to win a safe, convenient bride. A man does that for love and for atonement, and to prove with a deed what words could never prove. I asked you to show me the man and not to tell me. You have shown me. I see him. He knelt down on a ballroom floor and made the leap at last. So I will give you my answer, Honora went on, and I will give it as plainly as you gave your confession, for plainness is the only coin I have ever dealt in, and you had better grow used to it if you mean to spend your life with me. A week ago, I did not know whether you had truly changed or had merely waited until claiming me grew cheap enough to manage. And had you come to me with soft words in a private room and a safe, quiet offer, I should have refused you, and been right to, for I will not be any man's afterthought or any man's convenience. But you did not do that. You did the hard, public, costly thing, the thing that gains a man nothing but the woman he kneels for. And so I believe you, Your Grace, as I could not have believed any words. I believe you have become the man who would have leapt for me 10 years ago, because you have just leapt for me now, when it was every bit as hard and a great deal more public. The proof is real. I have watched you pay for it. And so my answer is not the answer of a grateful spinster rescued from the shelf. Understand that, all of you, and understand it, Your Grace, most of all. I do not need rescuing. I was never on the shelf. I have a brother who would house me, and a sister who would keep me, and a character that would earn my bread, and a peace in my own heart that needs no man to complete it. I am not accepting you because I need you. I am accepting you because I have weighed you, with my eyes open and every other door standing wide behind me. And I find that the reformed, brave, honest man kneeling on this floor is a man I should like to spend my life beside, freely as an equal, by my own choice, having lost nothing of myself and gained a companion worth the having. That is the only way I will ever come to any man, not claimed but freely given, not rescued but choosing. On those terms, Your Grace, and only those, yes, I will have you. Get up off that floor. You have knelt long enough for both the 10 years. Get up and let us begin, late but not too late, like two people who have at last had the courage to choose each other in the open. And the Duke of Ellesmere rose, slowly, his face transformed, 10 years of melancholy falling away from it like a discarded cloak. And he did not seize her or sweep her up or behave in any way as a man behaves who has claimed a prize. He took her hand, gravely, gratefully, the way a man takes a gift he knows he has not deserved and means to spend his life deserving, and he raised it to his lips, and he said, for her and for the whole listening room, freely given and freely taken then as equals, and never claimed. And I will spend every day of the rest of my life, Honora, being the man who made the leap, and never again the coward who would not. You have made me wait 10 years and kneel on a ballroom floor before the whole county, and I tell you, it is the best bargain I have ever made, and the cheapest at the price, and I would do all of it again tenfold for this moment. Thank you. Thank you for choosing me. I will not make you regret it. It was, the county agreed for years afterward, the most extraordinary scene anyone had ever witnessed at a country assembly. And in the midst of it, scarcely noticed, the Baroness Mowbray, exposed before the whole of the society she ruled, named as a liar by a duke, her 10 years of giggling cruelty turned in an instant into the thing the whole room now whispered and stared at, gathered her lace and her ruined consequence, and slipped from the room. And she found, in the weeks that followed, that a woman who has been publicly revealed as the petty author of another's decade of suffering is not, after all, so very welcome in the drawing-rooms she once commanded, and the county, which is fickle, and which had been ready enough to mock Honora when mockery was the fashion, discovered all at once that it had always, really admired the brave Selwyn girl tremendously, and turned its back on the Baroness with the same easy cruelty it had once turned on Honora, which was a kind of justice, though a rough one, and is more than such women usually get. The first honest, private, unhurried conversation they had as an engaged pair happened a few days after the assembly on a quiet afternoon, with no audience and no society and nothing grand about it, in the same small parlor where he had made his confession. And it was as unlike the great public scenes that had brought them there as a still pool, as unlike a waterfall, and a great deal more to the purpose, for it was where the two of them at last began the slow, real work of becoming, after 10 lost years, simply two people who loved each other. For a moment, alone together with the mass all down and the world shut out, they hardly knew how to begin. 10 years and a tragedy and 2 grand confessions lay between them, and the ordinary intimacy of an engaged couple seemed almost too simple a thing to reach for across so much. It was Honora who broke it, with the directness that was her nature. "We have a great deal of ground to make up, Your Grace," she said, "and I think we had better not pretend the 10 years did not happen, or paper over them with happiness, for they did happen, and they shaped us both. And a marriage built on pretending would be no better than one built on a lie. So let us be honest with each other, always, however hard. It is the only way I know how to be, and the only way I will live. I will tell you a true thing to begin. I have not forgiven you. Not yet. not fully. The wound was 10 years deep, and 3 grand gestures, however brave, do not close it in a week. There is a part of me that is still angry, that still grieves the youth I lost and the life we might have had, that still flinches at the thought of all those years you sat safe in the north while I stitched my eyes out by candlelight. I tell you this not to wound you, but because you should marry the whole of me, the anger with the love, and not some grateful, softened version that does not exist. Can you bear that? To marry a woman who loves you and is not yet done being angry at you? For that is what I am. And the Duke, who had braced for he knew not what, felt something in him ease, for here was the honesty he had failed at for 10 years, offered to him freely as the foundation of their life, and he found he wanted nothing more. "I can bear it," he said. "I would rather have your honest anger than another woman's easy adoration. It is worth more, being true. Be angry as long as you need. Name it whenever it rises. I will hear it every time and not flinch and not defend myself, for there is nothing to defend. You are right to be angry, and the day you are no longer angry, if it ever comes, will be a gift I shall not have earned, but shall treasure beyond anything. I have 10 years to make up to you, Honora, and I do not expect to make them up in a season, or a year, or perhaps ever entirely. I expect to spend my whole life at it, and to count the spending the best work I ever do. I ask only this, that you let me try, and that you go on telling me the truth, however hard, for the truth from you is the thing I starved for in all those silent years and could not get, and I find I am hungry for it past all bearing, even the truth of your anger, even that, especially that, for it is real, and you are real, and I have had enough of comfortable lies to last me 10 lifetimes. And Honora looked at him a long moment, and something in her clear, steady eyes warmed by a degree, not forgiveness yet, but the promise of it, the first thaw of a frost 10 years deep. And she said, more gently than she had yet spoken to him, "Then we shall do well enough, I think, in time. Not at once, but in time, for a marriage that can bear the truth can bear anything, and I begin to believe that ours can bear the truth. That is enough to begin on. It is, in fact, a great deal more than most begin on, who start with easy adoration and end with comfortable lies. We shall start with hard honesty, and end, I hope, with something earned and real and entirely our own." And she put out her hand to him, not to be kissed this time, but to be held plainly as one holds the hand of a person one means to walk a long road beside. And he took it and held it, just held it, as he had held it once in a garden 10 years before. And the holding, this time, was not the prelude to a tragedy, but the beginning of a long, late, hard-won happiness, and they both knew it, and were quiet together, and it was enough. The Dowager Countess of Stanmore came to call the morning after the assembly, having heard the whole astonishing tale from a dozen breathless sources before her chocolate was cold, and she sat Honora down and fixed her with the fierce black eyes that had cowed the county for 60 years, and asked the question she had promised to ask. "I told you, before the assembly, that you were in danger of refusing him out of fear and dressing the fear as principle, and I made you promise to be honest with yourself about which it was. So, you did not refuse him, you accepted him, before the whole county, in the grandest scene the county has witnessed in my lifetime, and I am very glad of it. But I will have my answer all the same, child, for the accepting could be as much a thing of the moment, swept along by the drama of it, as a refusal could have been a thing of fear. So tell me honestly, as you promised. When you said yes to that man on his knees, did you say it from your worth or from the wound? From strength or from the long loneliness finally telling you to take what comfort was offered? I shall know if you lie, and I love you too well to let you begin a marriage on a self-deception. Which was it?" And Honora, who had asked herself the same question through a sleepless night, took the old woman's hand and answered truly. "From my worth," she said. "I have examined it as closely as you could wish, your grace, and I am as sure of it as I am of anything. I know, because I tested it against the hardest measure I could find. I asked myself in the dark last night whether I would still be whole if I had refused him, whether, had he failed the test, had he come with soft private words instead of the public leap, and had I sent him away forever, I should have been broken by it, or merely sorry. And I found that I should have been only sorry, sorry for the waste, sorry for the love, but not broken. That I should have gone back to my life, my brother and my sister and my books and my peace, and been content, as I was content before he ever came, that I did not need him, and do not, and never did. And it was only because I found that, only because I was certain I could refuse him and survive whole, that I let myself accept him. For a thing you cannot refuse, you cannot truly choose, and I would not give myself to any man I could not have done without. I can do without him. That is exactly why I can have him. I chose from strength, your grace. I am sure of it. I spent my worth, as you bid me, freely, by my own judgment on a thing I had weighed and wanted. But I did not spend it from need, and I should still have my worth entire had I chosen to keep it. There. That is the truth, and I have looked at it hard, and it does not change. The Dowager Countess looked at her for a long moment, and then her fierce old face softened entirely, and she squeezed Honora's hand with a strength surprising in so old a grip. "That," she said, "is the answer I hoped for and did not quite dare expect. It is the answer of a woman who knows her worth so well that she can spend it without fear of being left poor, which is the only safe way a worth was ever spent. You have done the whole thing right, child, from first to last, the long sacrifice and the hard test, and the free choosing. And I am prouder of you than I have ever been of anyone, and I have known a great many people in 80 years. Marry your reformed duke, and be happy, and be angry at him as long as you need to, and keep your own money and your own counsel and your own self, as I know you will. And mind you bring him to call on me often, for I find I rather like a duke who can be brought to kneel on a ballroom floor for a woman worth kneeling for. It shows he has been properly educated at last, however late, and late education in a man is better than none. Now ring for the chocolate and tell me every word he said, for I had it second-hand from people who cannot be trusted to report a sentence faithfully, and I mean to have it from you, in full, with nothing left out. He groveled, I am told, magnificently. I have waited a long time to hear of a duke groveling for the right woman, leave nothing out. They were married that summer, quietly, in the small parish church where Lydia had been wed, with Thomas to read the service and Lydia to weep happily in the front pew and the fierce old Dowager Countess of Stanmore to give the bride away, for Honora would have it nowhere grander, and the Duke, who had learned at last the worth of quiet, true things over grand, showy ones, would have it exactly as she wished. She came to him with no fortune and no grand connections and not the smallest thing in the world, but herself. And the Duke of Ellesmere, who had once weighed her against his rank and found, in his cowardice, that his rank weighed more, settled upon her at their marriage a fortune and an independence that were entirely her own, beyond any power of his to touch, not because she asked it, for she asked for nothing, but because he had come to understand exactly why a woman who had once been abandoned to her own resources would want, ever after, resources that were her own, and because he wished, in the one language money speaks, to say to her that she was not a thing he had claimed, but a sovereign who had consented to share her sovereignty, and might withdraw it, and would always have somewhere of her own to stand. There was one hurdle the Duke of Ellesmere had not anticipated, and it proved the stiffest of all, and it was named Thomas Selwyn. For Honora's brother, the boy of 12 she had raised, now a grave young clergyman of 23 with a curacy of his own and his sister's own steady eyes, did not, when he came to meet the great man who proposed to marry the sister he worshipped, behave at all as a poor young curate is supposed to behave toward a duke. He was perfectly civil. He was also, beneath the civility, as hard as flint, for Thomas remembered, as Lydia had been too young to remember, the worst of the early years, remembered his sister stitching by candlelight till her eyes streamed, remembered her going without dinner so that he and Lydia might eat, remembered the cold winters and the turned gowns and the ceaseless grinding labor she bore without complaint. And Thomas had long ago made a private vow that no one should ever again take advantage of Honora, who had given everything and asked nothing. And he had, moreover, heard the whole story now, and knew that the grave great man before him was the very one who had abandoned her 10 years ago to all that suffering. And so Thomas Selwyn looked the Duke of Ellesmere in the eye in Honora's small parlor and said quietly, and without the smallest deference, "You will forgive me, your grace, if I do not simply rejoice. My sister tells me you have confessed your fault and made your amends, and she is the wisest person I know, and if she has chosen to forgive you, or to begin to, then I will not gainsay her. But I watched her suffer for 10 years what you might have spared her, and I find I cannot forget it merely because you have at last knelt down on a ballroom floor. So I will say this to you plainly, Duke or no Duke, as the nearest thing to a father she has. She is worth 10 of you, and you know it. And the only thing that reconciles me to this match at all is that you appear to know it. See that you never forget it. See that you spend the rest of your life remembering exactly what she is, and exactly what she gave, and exactly what you failed to do, and being grateful every single day for the second chance she had no obligation to grant you. Do that, and we shall be friends. Fail in it. Let me ever once see her made less than she is, by you or by your world, and you will find that a poor curate can be a very inconvenient brother-in-law to a duke. I do not threaten. I merely inform. Now, will you take a glass of wine? It is not good wine. We are not grand people, but it is offered honestly, which is more than my sister got from your world for 10 years. And the Duke of Ellesmere, who could have crushed this impertinent young curate with a word, and who instead felt a deep and growing respect, did not take offense, but bowed his head and said, "You are quite right, in every particular, and I honor you for saying it, and I would think less of you if you had not. She is worth 10 of me, I do know it, and I shall spend my life remembering it exactly as you say. I am glad she has you to guard her. She has had too few guardians and too many users, and a brother who will be inconvenient on her behalf is precisely what I should wish for her. Let us be friends, then, on those terms, which are the only honorable ones. And I will take the wine gladly and find it better than any in my cellar, for the reason you name." And he took it and drank it, and the two men looked at each other with a wary, dawning regard, and Thomas, telling Lydia of it afterward, admitted, grudgingly, that the Duke might do, for he did not pull rank Liddy when he might have, and he agreed she was worth 10 of him, which is the only correct opinion on the subject, and a man who holds the correct opinion on Honora may be educated in time to deserve her, though it will take some doing, which was, from Thomas Selwyn, very nearly a benediction. She was a great success as a duchess, in her dry, clear-eyed way, though she never much cared for the world that had once scorned her, and was now so eager to flatter her, and spent as little time in it as her position allowed, preferring her books and her husband and the quiet of the country and the company of the few she loved. She brought Thomas's growing family to stay, and Lydia's, and filled the great echoing house of Ellesmere, which had been silent and melancholy for a generation, with the noise of children and the warmth she had always carried in her, and never before had room to spend. And the Duke, watching her, marveled daily at the life he had so nearly thrown away, and never once, in all the years that followed, took it for granted, for a man who has spent 10 years alone with his own cowardice does not forget the worth of the second chance he scarcely deserved. They grew old together and were happy, not with the easy happiness of those whom life has never tested, but with the deep earned happiness of two people who found their way back to each other across 10 lost years and a lie and a failure of courage, and who knew every day exactly what they had been given and what it had cost and what it was worth. As for the Baroness Mowbray, Honora met her once more, some 2 years into her marriage, and what passed between them showed, better than any triumph could have, The difference between the two women, and why the one had always been the greater, though the world took so long to see it. The Baroness had fallen far. The public unmasking at Lady Carberry's assembly had been the beginning of it. A woman revealed as the petty author of another's decade of suffering, named a liar by a duke before the whole county, does not easily recover her consequence, and Selina Mowbray had not recovered hers. The fashionable doors that had once opened to her opened now reluctantly or not at all. The giggling court that had surrounded her had melted away to surround someone safer to be seen with. Her husband, the Baron, never a strong man, had grown cold and resentful under the cloud she had brought on them, and she had sunk by degrees into the bitter, diminished half-life of a once powerful woman whom society has quietly decided to forget. And Honora, now Duchess of Ellesmere, with the whole of that same society at her feet, might have completed the ruin with a word, had she wished it, might have cut the Baroness publicly, or repeated the old story, or simply let it be known that the Duchess did not receive her, which would have finished what remained of Selina Mowbray's standing for good. She did none of these things. They met by chance, at a great house where both were guests, the Baroness lingering uncertainly at the edge of a room she had once commanded, watching the Duchess of Ellesmere be courted by the very people who had abandoned her, and Honora, seeing her there, alone and diminished and braced visibly for a cut, crossed the room to her, and the watching company held its breath, expecting at last the long-deferred revenge. And the Duchess of Ellesmere said quietly, for the Baroness alone, "Lady Mowbray, I hope I find you well." That was all. A civil greeting, neither warm nor cold, the ordinary courtesy of one lady to another, but in that room, at that moment, it was an act of enormous consequence, for it told the watching world that the Duchess did not hold the Baroness beneath her notice, did not stoop to revenge, did not need to grind a fallen enemy to feel secure in her own height, and it was, therefore, a far completer victory than any cut could have been, and both women knew it. The Baroness, who had armed herself for cruelty, and met instead this composed, indifferent courtesy, found she had no weapon against it at all. She stammered some reply, and the Duchess inclined her head and moved on, and that was the whole of it. Honora never spoke of it afterward, and would not be drawn on it. But to the Dowager Countess, who pressed her, "You might have finished her, child, and many would say she deserved it. Why did you not?" She said only this, "Because I am not what she is, your grace, and I will not become what she is in order to punish her for being it. She spent her life needing other women to be smaller so that she might feel large. I have never needed that, and I will not begin now, least of all with her, for to revenge myself on her would be to admit that her cruelty had a power over me that it never had. She is fallen and lonely and bitter, and that is punishment enough, and not of my making, but of her own. I need add nothing to it. And besides," she added, with the dry flash that never quite left her, "the kindest cut I could possibly deal her was to be kind, for nothing in the world could have galled Selina Mowbray so much as to be greeted civilly before everyone by the unclaimed spinster she once giggled at, now a duchess who could not even be troubled to hate her. I confess I did enjoy that. One may forgive an enemy, your grace, and still take a quiet pleasure in the particular form one's forgiveness happens to take. I am not a saint. I am only a woman who knows her own worth too well to spend any of it on revenge." And the Dowager Countess laughed until she wept, and said it was the most perfectly aimed mercy she had ever heard of, and that Honora was wasted on a duke, and ought to have governed a kingdom. And the word "unclaimed," which had once been thrown at her like a stone, Honora kept, in a way, all her life, kept it and turned it and wore it like a jewel, for she would say sometimes to the young women who came to her over the years, frightened of being left on the shelf, frightened that their worth depended on being chosen, "I was unclaimed until I was 30, and I have never been sorry for an hour of it, for I belonged to myself all that while, and spent myself where I chose, and a woman who belongs to herself is the only kind who can ever truly give herself to anyone. Do not be afraid of being unclaimed, my dears. Be afraid only of being cheaply claimed, or of being collected like a parcel by some man who never had to be brave to deserve you, Wait, if you must wait, for the one who will make the leap. And if he never comes, then keep yourself and spend yourself on what you love, and know that you were never less than whole. I was never unclaimed. I was only ever my own. And when at last I gave myself freely as an equal to a man who had learned to be brave. And that, and not the giving up of myself to the first comfortable offer, is what it means for a woman to be worth the having. So bank your fire now, and turn your lamp low, and let the dark draw gentle and close. A cruel woman giggled that a good woman was still unclaimed at 30, and a duke's carriage was already at the gate, 10 years too late, carrying a reformed coward come to make at last the leap he had once been too small to make. And the good woman, who had spent her youth in love and labor and never counted it a loss, owned the room that had mocked her and named her own worth, and chose her happiness freely as an equal on her own terms, having been rescued by no one because she had never needed rescuing, for she belonged first and last and always to herself. Somewhere tonight by some fire I shall never see, you have kept her company to the end of her story, and I am glad of it, more glad than I can say, and I should dearly love to know where in the world you have been listening from. Remember that your worth is your own, claimed by no one, established by no one's choosing of you, but your own keeping of yourself. Sleep well. There will be another fire and another story when next the candles are lit.